All right, wonderful. Let's. Would each of you mind introducing yourself and really what the conversation was about at your table?
Hi, my name is Clarissa Joan Middleton, and I am an interaction designer and game developer by trade. And my talk today at the Lunch and Learn was on the practicality of faith in a technology-driven society.
Cool. I'm Don Boyce, and I'm the VP of Partnerships for a professional esports organization called Cloud9. The conversation at our lunch table was about esports and gaming, and basically community and the role of the body in those communities.
I'm Matthew Eppinette. I'm the director of the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity at Trinity, TEDS, the competition. But I have 2 degrees from here, so. And our conversation was on transhumanism as a post-secular religion and what kind of resources that might give us for dealing with these issues.
I'm sorry, I missed that one. My name is Matt Lumpkin. I'm a digital product designer with tidepool.org. We're making diabetes software that automates the tedious care of type 1 diabetes by integrating devices with an iOS app. And we talked about the power of bringing people with disabilities, people living with challenges into the design team itself to not just provide subject matter expertise, but actually to shape the design process and how that's been embodied in some DIY projects, and then also how it can be maybe extended to some other communities beyond type 1.
My name is Greg Cootsona, and I'm a Presbyterian pastor, having served in churches for 20 years, and now I'm a professor or lecturer in comparative religion and science at Chico State. I've also, up north of here, I've also done some work at the project at the STAR office, our science and theology office here at Fuller, particularly on science and theology for emerging adult ministries. So I'm wearing a t-shirt that memorializes a scene from Nacho Libre, where Esqueleto says, "I only believe in science," and his partner in free wrestling, Nacho, baptizes him. Stealth baptism. And so the question is, do we stealth baptize science and technology, or do we integrate it more into our ministries with emerging adults?
Hi, I'm Enoch Charles. I'm an instructional technologist at SUM Bible College and Theological Seminary, about 400 miles up north from here. I'm also work as a GRI scholar and a distance GRI scholar here. And our topic in the table was on discerning machine intelligence, basically artificial intelligence and machine learning. How do we discern the usage of such technologies in theological education, instructional technology?
Great, thank you. I was wondering if we could go across the panel again and just if you could share briefly a fascinating thread from your discussion, if it went to a particular space or it had a particular energy about it, if you could share that for those of us who weren't at your table. And so, yeah, if you wouldn't mind going ahead and doing that.
So my talk was broken up into 3 parts: the why, the what, and the how of the practicality of faith in our technology-driven society. And we looked at the need for practicing our faith to decrease cognitive dissonance for the believer. We talked about how adults in America consume 11 hours of content a day, and the missing gap of spiritual development, spiritual discipline, spiritual formation, or theological content, experts being a part of the designing and the storytellers within that content, and how that creates this lack of awareness for us as believers as to seeing the promises of God and our embodied experience as people of faith in the media and in the content that we consume. And so one of the questions that arose for the panel, for the people, was about trust and this lack of trust for us as a community of faith for the technology. We don't trust the technology, we don't trust the content makers, so we don't want to be there. But that us, we got to the point where we said, do we have to trust them in order to observe it and understand it? And if we observe it and understand it, can we find ways in which that we can relate to it? Because by just ejecting ourselves from the arena, we are also ejecting our expertise. And then then it got on the topic of youth and understanding and relating to the youth and their need for relativity when they're thinking and learning and perceiving the gospel, and how it is important that if they're in this space all the time, the technological spaces, be it gaming or social media, how can we put ourselves in there too for ourselves and for them to create cognitive consonance and to help them affect regulate against the cognitive dissonance that this can cause for the believer.
One of the interesting threads from our conversation was about, we kind of got to the heart of it when talking about esports and how it's related to kind of traditional sports. And we talked about, it's been mentioned about AI as kind of being developed for war. And so, the connection between sports and war as sports historically being kind of preparatory for war. Today, when you think about sports, throwing a small ball into a hoop is not quite preparatory for war, but ironically enough, it's esports and gaming that is most preparatory for war. And so what does that say about, our bodies when and not to kind of wade into the transhumanist waters that we talked about, where there's this strong mind-body dualism. But to say, part of war is about kind of suppressing the pain or what the body undergoes, and in the service of some end, which is kind of killing your opponent, right? And so, how is that something that is now being picked up in this gaming tradition, where basically players on our team are playing for 12 to 14 hours a day. And where's the body there? And how does the church interact and avoid a situation where it's reinforcing kind of patterns of mutual escape, right? Because we basically said that's kind of a little bit what it is, right? It's a bunch of people who want to escape and be in this kind of not pseudo community, but be in this very fragile community where they're playing alongside each other. And how does the church kind of interact in that setting?
Wow, really interesting stuff. We had a great conversation at our table. It's hard to pick one thing, but one of the things that we talked about is just how broad these topics are. And I mean, technology is just a huge concept. And so sometimes the engagement then tends to be very broad, but very shallow. And so we talked a lot about, as Christian scholars, how can we really dig deep into biblical studies to engage transhumanism, to engage just technology broadly, but with a real depth of analysis that's really gospel-centered, gospel-driven, and that examines very deeply what the Bible and what Scripture has to teach to Christians trying to live today in a technological society.
I had to scratch out the word transhumanism from the title up card after Ilya Delio's talk, helpful critique. I've been working in technology and away from seminary for about 7 months, and so like my academic scholarly muscles are kind of weak. So I was not familiar with the subtle nuance between posthuman and transhuman discourses. But the posthuman discourse I thought was really helpful. It really informed where we were going with the talk, which was around this idea of beginning the design of new technologies from the position of people who have been disempowered. And I came into this through the experience of living with type 1. But as I've expanded that focus out and talked to communities like the autism spectrum disorder community, the muscular dystrophy community, what I find is it's a really common experience for the lived experience of that disease or that challenge to be marginalized, both in the experience of things that are designed to make your life better, don't seem to involve the people who actually live with the problem, which is sort of like design 101. But in particular, they seem to, sometimes we find that there's actually an embeddedness of paternalism, of values of patriarchy even, embedded in these design solutions for people that are living with these challenges. And the surprising thing that came out of our conversation is that this is not even limited to chronic disease or disability. In fact, one of the people at our table shared that her experience of engaging the medical profession in general was one of marginalization, paternalism, suspicion of her experience of her own body, and that this dynamic extends beyond. This is really a dynamic of power and whose experience gets to be centered and who gets to be decentered. I think this is a broader dynamic that is in some ways magnified by technology's capability to embed and embody our best and worst impulses as people, and then automate them to repeat. And so if you have a really wonderful experience that's very hospitable and designed to make sense of and help someone's experience, it gets amplified. But similarly, if you have a patriarchal, paternalistic, disempowering value system that's embedded in that technology, it just grinds people down even more.
I find myself pondering these things that have been said so far. Even though, by my reckoning, I only grew up 5 miles away from where Wozniak and Jobs developed the personal computer, I did not grow up as a digital native. And in my very first ordained call, we had this church where 150 of our new members were emerging adults. So I say that because I've learned I have to listen a lot. And continue to listen. So the people who are now 28 are different from the people who are 18 in terms of their engagement with technology. And that meant that one of the things that came out of our conversation was something I heard one of our participants bring, which was that in his ministry with college students, there's a real social anxiety that's come from all the virtual relationships, that real relationships are very scary. And that may suppress being in a real community, meaning just a community of physical co-presence. It may make people very nervous when they actually go to like a college group or a worship service or that sort of thing. And so this was the negative side of the ledger, but we were trying to figure out, what do we do with just the reality that iGen has so many of their relationships that are started virtually and that are managed virtually? Is that what are the positives and what are the negatives? And this seemed to be one of the negatives that we wanted to pastorally care for in the church. If there is all this anxiety about having a real relationship, how do we become ministers in that kind of environment where loving your neighbor does also mean loving your neighbor in a physically co-present way?
Our table, it was mainly most of us were in some way or form involved in theological education. So the conversation then was on how artificial intelligence or machine learning can make inroads into theological education. I mean, from my own experience as now working as an instructional technologist at SUM, I reflected, it started from my own background I had a life of programming. I began my career in programming and then moved into theological education. Now I'm trying to do something which can combine the two. So I was just sharing, and then we reflected on how machine learning is an entirely different animal from regular programming, traditional programming. Because I knew traditional programming. I started as a traditional programmer. I coded in C, COBOL, Oracle, and all those things, working on retail banking application and so forth. But right now, after completing 2 graduate degrees in theology, now I'm working in this field as an instruction technologist. I'm looking at software applications and evaluating software. I'm a technology user now and looking at so machine learning is an entirely different animal. So I was sharing how that, and then there were some great questions and conversations about how machine learning and artificial intelligence, what are some of the repercussions, challenges, opportunities, risks in kind of engaging that. So there are some the ethical issues of the privacy, handling data, some of the issues that were covered yesterday. So transparency, accountability. I mean, one of the questions we engaged was also who is responsible for the software ultimately, right? Who is is it a vendor or us? In those kinds of questions that came up that I thought were very fascinating.
Hi, my name is Bala Musa. I'm a professor of communication studies. Okay, thanks. My name is Bala Musa. I'm a professor of communication studies at Azusa Pacific University. I didn't come down right away because I saw we didn't have enough chairs, so I wanted to prefer my brothers and sisters here. So at our table, we are wrestling with the question of, is technology deterministic or is it neutral? is technology ours to use as we like, or does it sometimes use us to accomplish its own agenda? As Neil Postman said, he says, technology giveth and it taketh. And in us choosing what medium to use in order to propagate the gospel, we need to be very conscious of the fact that sometimes it can do our bidding to accomplish whatever goal we want, but that also has a mind of its own. And sometimes it constrains us and forces us to do its own bidding. And what is the implication then for sharing the gospel in urban environment as well as in rural environment? That because these environments are different, and even within the environment there are different structures, we need to think about the implications before we actually choose which medium. The values, we talked about the values, the positive things, we gave historical instances of how technology have been used to advance the gospel, but we also looked at the fact that in many cases there are disadvantages, and in choosing one medium over another, we have to think about how the medium allows us to value the people, to engage with them, to understand their context, to know that the medium allows us to speak in a language that also empowers the other person that we're communicating with. So it was a very robust conversation, just looking at instances where the gospel the technology has served the church and served the gospel well, and instances where, as Neil Postman talks, it's about how television, for instance, is a medium of entertainment. And so any institution that does not entertain cannot survive in television. And the generational difference between young people and elderly people, between different cultures, require that we think about how choosing one technology can empower or disempower, can bring in, include or exclude different people. And the people around the table talk about from various historical contexts, their communities where they've come from, and how they thought that those use of technology could be a benefit, but also a drawback.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. I was wondering if I could ask each of you to share on how it is that you think about your work with technology. Is it foreign to think of your work with technology as an expression of love your neighbor? Is there another guiding principle that motivates you and guides you in your work? Is it a foreign idea to be thinking about loving your neighbor as you work with your technology? Is it something that's hand in glove? How do you think about your work with technology in terms of theologically?
So my work actually begins at that very place because I study technology to understand how we could enhance human development and how we could fill the void, the spiritual wealth gap void of, we look at human development as solely based on education, as solely based on income, and as solely based on life longevity. But what about the internal cognitive psyche of the person and their own emotional wellness? And when we talk about love being one of the goals of Christianity and your capacity to love your neighbor as much as you love yourself, you need to understand if you actually love yourself and if you actually obtain within your own being like a concept or an identity that feels whole and real for you. And a lot of times what's happening for people of faith, because the average person is consuming 11 hours of content a day, but content in the historical tradition is all about conflict with no loving resolve, whereas, and it's about consumption. So it's about conflict and consumption. And our Bible is about peace and productivity or fruitfulness. So it's important that we create spaces and for people to explore how they can be peaceful and how they can be productive and fruitful. And then through that lens, they can relate to other people in a peaceful and in a productive way. And so in the past with linear entertainment, such as television or radio, people didn't have choice. We eliminated free will. And so with technology, we now have this, we can serve niche markets without the need to say, oh, if you don't have 2 million views or 3 million views at 8 o'clock on Thursday, we can't show that. Now it's, you can get 6 million views in one day, and that's because everyone has access it through online and people can choose. So that technology is enhancing our capacity to choose what we want to relate to or not relate to. We need to be there, and we need to make sure that we are designing experiences that give people enough options, especially for believers, especially for people of faith, and turning this idea that it's all about conflict and it's all about consumption, and and not about peace and not about productivity on its head. So the meditation apps that I designed, the self-reflection apps that I designed, they're all on self-examination to test whether you're in alignment with your faith.
I think one of the most interesting things for me is talking to these professional video game players who, a lot of them, and I've worked for probably 3 different professional video game teams at this point. A lot of the professional players are people that come from really broken families. And what's super interesting is that it's not, these other narratives of Christianity that really resonate with them, but it's the narrative that Christ himself, God himself, knows abandonment, right? And so there's this generation of male gamers that need to hear that story. And actually, when I talk to these, very kind of influential professional players, it's that story that resonates with them. And whether that's the abandonment of a father, the abandonment from themselves, which I think is also kind of equally interesting, that I see as kind of an important part of the work that I'm doing is engaging with these basically just male generation that wants to kind of recede from the world and to try to, basically come up with a narrative or find a thread within the gospel that resonates with them and with that audience.
So my work is a little bit different when it comes to technology. As a scholar, technology is one of the areas that I deal with under the heading of bioethics. But it's really an interesting question that you would ask. A couple of weeks ago, I spoke in the departmental chapel. So Trinity has a college and a divinity school. I spoke in the departmental chapel for the college and trying to, among other things, encourage them to consider enrolling in our master's program in bioethics. But I used this text, that the arena of bioethics is a way of loving your neighbor, that people are wrestling with very real questions about what to do around infertility, around end-of-life issues, and around technology. And that one of the ways that we can love our neighbor is to help them to think about these issues, provide them with tools and resources and biblical grounding for considering how do I respond to these various aspects of life.
I do think that this narrative of loving your neighbor as yourself does enter in a great deal into the work that I do with technology. The software that I'm working on actually came from a sort of do-it-yourself community of people like myself. My youngest daughter has type 1 diabetes, and several people were frustrated with how the tools worked or didn't work for them or didn't seem to be designed with them in mind. And so they took control of these devices and redesigned and reconfigured how they work in a way that would actually matter for quality of life for them. Once I then began using those tools, I saw the really stark difference between a tool that is made from the top down, that says, I will tell you how this is going to work, and if you would just do what I say to do, it'll be fine, and you don't get to have a say in it. Versus maybe the next level, which is to say, I'm going to design something that how I would want it to work for me, and you'll use it, and it'll be good for you. But that only works if we are centered in the same cultural location or the same situation. I think a better rule for design is not the golden rule, but maybe the platinum rule of to do unto others as they would have done unto them.
Wow, that's loud. I kind of like that. I had the deep voice of God or something. Donald, right? Yeah, if I can just respond to one thing you just said, it reminds me of the Eisenhower altarpiece in Colmar. That was one of Karl Barth's favorite places for meditation, where the Jesus on the cross was like racked with pain and distorted and disfigured, and how that became a healing for people at the time when there was plagues and all that sort of thing. And maybe that's part of the Christian story. We often suppress or expand the Christian story depending. And of course, in a militaristic time, it's always the Christ who's the triumph and who never suffers. But maybe we need a little bit of the brokenness again. to your question, I think this was a new metaphor for me. How do we love our digital neighbors? And I think for me in my ministry of teaching, it's how do I love my younger neighbors who've been affected digitally, who are digitally connected. That's my connection with it. And there are two sides to it. One is I look at them and I think, you guys, you people, guys, of course, in California is a gender inclusive term. You guys are going to change the world. You have the capacity to do things I've never would know how to do because I'm not a digital native. And I just love hearing the insights that come, either if it's in the church or in my classroom in the university. So that's the first way of trying to love, is to try to incarnate the ability to hear somebody else's story. The second thing that I think is I also look at them and I think, because I think my own kids are 21, they are 21 and 24. They're affected by this, and the rates of depression and suicide and bullying and all the negatives that go along with this digitally mediated world. I just think I'm old enough now to think, how can I care for you? And I'm enough, I hope, of a pastor to say, I really want to care for you. And so that's the side of loving that I think about, is those two sides. Loving as in emptying myself to incarnate listening and learning as an older person, and then loving in the sense of, can I care for you? Can I walk alongside and help heal your brokenness, or at least be broken with you?
Thank you. I mean, for me, right now in my current role as an instructional technologist, I'm a user of technology as well as an evaluator of technology, whether it's a software so it's like a student information system or a LMS, learning management system, or a CRM. Now they call the new league of systems as LRM, which is like a learning relationship management systems. Whatever it is, AI seems like every new vendor is talking about AI and all things like that. So when you evaluate and look at software, and when you're kind of working with vendors and talking to them, so we discussed that in our group as well, is I have 4 questions. I use the theological criteria would seep through these kinds of 4 questions. One is the why, the motivation for why do we as a theological institution need this software, and why are we going for this? Are we just fascinated by every wind and wave and kind of want to go after the technology? It's good to hear as a software developer some of those things going on behind it, but why are we going for it? Is it going to give us a lot of money, or is it a kind of a self-aggrandizement, or it's more like why are we going for it? Is it ultimately going to honor God? And also, it deeply connected with that is our vision of the technology. What kind of vision we have. Our vision is not a naturalistic or a technistic vision of this world. We have a vision of a God who's sovereign, so creation is a gift. So we look at from that. So technology is a tool, and God is ultimately sovereign. So from that perspective, that is motivated by that. The motivations are shaped by our vision of technology and our vision of who God is. And then comes the question of how. The question of what, it's the objective. What are we going to do with that technology? So, and what are we going to, why this feature in machine learning feature, or a predictive algorithm, or whatever it is? Why do we need that? What are we going to do with that? So there, I think I'm helped with some of those things that I've been reading on some of these people who talk in the intersections of these mention ultimately, how is it going to improve the student's learning experience, right? Or what are we going to achieve for the student? Things like that. So laying it out, we go for this because it's going to create this outcome, which is going to be important for our educational purposes, for our students, and for our faculty, and so on and so forth. And the third question is, of course, is what for or where. That is like basically, where is it taking us? So again, it is I tie it to the organizational mission. For example, our organization talks about empowering leaders for 5-fold ministry. We have a clear organizational goals as to what, as a theological education institution, we want to achieve. So, and the question is, bringing this technology or bringing this innovation and bringing this thing, software, whatever it is it going to take us there in what God has given us for, and will it help us to be good stewards in that achieving that goal? And then finally, the how aspect of it, the means in which we achieve it. That's where I think some of the conversations that I was blessed to see, some of the conversations that came out yesterday in datafication and stuff like that. the ethics of it, the privacy, the transparency, accountability, and so many aspects there that govern responsibility aspects of it. How are you going to engage that? What kind of vendors are we choosing? And how do we know what's going on there? Especially if you are inheriting some algorithm, predictive algorithms, do we know what's going on? Can we tell the students that? And all those kinds of questions. And how do we manage that? How do we test that software? Those kinds of things.
Yeah, I come to the discussion and study of new media in particular from the point of ethics and the implications for culture change. This facilitation around our table was supposed to have with me my colleague, Professor Ibrahim Ahmadu, who was not able to come. He's a theologian, and so we kind of have ongoing dialogue. We've written a number of works in the area of new media and religion, new media literacy, and the youth. And with our emphasis is on skills for the youth, which is very easy because they are netizens. They are able to quickly adopt new media, but there isn't the challenging question of what is the underlying value, because there's a logic in creating all of this media. And because of the media saturation, somebody mentioned yesterday that new media in particular is invisible around us as they're embedded in that environment. They need to cultivate skills beyond just consumption, but also literacy that includes wisdom. And wisdom is that element that seems to be missing in an information-rich environment. So we want to challenge them to think about the effect on life, the effect on their relationships, the effect on their goals and careers, because it can be, quote-unquote, narcotizing, because the media doesn't leave us. In the past, you could leave the book, you walk away from the book, you can walk away from television, you can go from whatever medium, but today it is tethered to us. We're anchored to it at all times. So we were wrestling with to what extent then can anything that you consider important, whether it's the gospel, whether it's people's health, whether it's people's relationship, how can it rise up in an environment with so much cacophony of voices that there is not a break from information? There is a break from data. There is not a time that you can break away. To what extent can you use this medium to cause them to have space to reflect, to think beyond knowledge, beyond just interpretation of data, to embed wisdom as part of their use and application of new media?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Just building on that, I'm wondering, and I'll just let anyone who answer, if you feel inspired to answer. We don't have to go straight across. But to what extent do you think that the design or the writing of code or the development of a technology is influenced by our theology, our perspective of what it means to be human? How does that impact the code that we write, the design that we do? Is there any correlation between those? Is there a deep connection? And anyone who is more on the technical end who wants to answer, or if you want to weigh in, but yeah, anyone?
I'm not on the technical side, but I think the relationship from communication point is the fact that the codes are language systems. And because the codes are language systems, they allow you to express certain kinds of meaning. They express certain kinds of value. And they expand your horizon to say things that you are not able to say with virtual media and so on and so forth in an analog environment. But at the same time, they restrict what you're able to say because the designer has an intention in mind. There's a logic behind it. So it's not as free, as liberating as it typically would be assumed. And so it's important that the individuals know to what extent it is empowering, enable them to do things that they cannot do without the power of this tool, but to what extent it's also limiting because it's designed to function in a specific way. And we talk about the fact that the way we use language also has ontological implications for how we are as people, how we think, and what we even think about. So those, I think, are some of the ways I reflect on that.
I was was reading Dr. Callaway's article there on the Fuller magazine on technology, that he gives some people that he mentions that are developing software on those lines, in which creative ways of writing software which contribute to human flourishing. And he gave some examples. I could immediately relate to one of my own friends. He lives in Virginia Beach now. He's a good friend of mine, Dr. Blisson, and he's a theological educator himself. He teaches theology, and he's a good preacher. But at the same time, he's immensely gifted in technology, and he's a technology entrepreneur, runs a company. And I think I remember one of the conversations we had, and that what he shared with me, it stuck in my head or in my heart. So what he said, some of the programs that he's developing, especially he's into healthcare and into education sectors, he develops software for that. And he said, some of these things, when I develop, he said, it gives great meaning to me. I really enjoy developing these kinds of things because I know this is going to help somebody get better. Some of the things that he's developing are directly missional. Like, in some countries, it's helping directly in the propagation of the gospel. Or it could be something like a healthcare system, helping people to, using these AI and other technologies to do that. So for me, takeaways for a Christian, and for him as a software developer and as a technology entrepreneur, he talks about the joy that he has in creating meaningful stuff that is contributing to human flourishing.
Yeah, I think that it's the designs that we experience are intrinsic to who the designer is. If one of the things that we talk about in interactive media and games is experience goals. So when I go out and I have an intention to design an experience, I am designing that. I'm making design decisions based on my experience goals for the end user. And so one of the main experience goals that I always have is godliness, because thinking about if I'm going to love my neighbor as I love myself, and that's going to be parallel to my understanding of loving God, I have to understand the characteristic traits of God. And if I don't understand that, then I can't design for them. So the more designers that we have that are spiritually inclined and theologically inclined, the more technology will mirror that. And the less that we have, the less it will mirror that.
I just want to add on to that and say that there are lots of folks designing software and writing code that probably don't think they have a theology. I think Matthew's writing a book trying to argue to the contrary, that in fact there's an implicit theology that a lot of folks operate with, whether it's Nietzsche's theology or whether it's some new novel American religious movement that's trying to have heaven without a deity. And that we might call it theology, we might call it your collection of assumptions, we might call it your worldview, we might call it, again, what kinds of experience get to count, what assumptions that you're conscious of and what assumptions you're not conscious of. Just like all linguistic systems, they push and pull on us. And there are some thoughts you can think only in certain languages and not in others. And so the more that one can move beyond the theological or assumption system that they began with and engage with those maybe that are different from them, if that's the intended audience for their software or hardware solution tool, the better off, the more able you will be able to make a design that is not just an embodiment of your vision, but maybe has room for more people than those who are just like you.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else? No. Okay. So if you, we just have a couple minutes left, but if you could share one thing about technology and just the development of it and your participation in it that you are hopeful about going forward in the future, that you feel like is something that is inspiring you, gives you hope. Maybe you see God's fingerprints on this move. Is there something that gives you hope around the kind of conversations we had today? Not everyone has to answer, but if something around what we've talked about with technology is inspiring you for the future, if you could share that briefly.
Yeah, I can go. I think one of the ones that, this is a good question because I need some hope, is the question of wearable technology. I think that a lot of times it's done as a marketing exercise, like, oh look, we're doing wearable technology, and it actually doesn't. It's not very helpful at the end of the day. But one of the things that we're working on right now is wearable technology that helps alert are players to themselves before they're conscious of it. So that's measuring stress levels on their skin, their heart rate, etc. And we'll just give them a little tap, a reminder to basically say, hey, we call it tilting. It's basically you're angry and you're going to play bad right now if you stay angry. And so this is just a little tap to remind them, hey, you might not know it yet, but you're experiencing anger, whatever it is that you're feeling, and you're gonna perform badly because of it. So I think that's something that I'm hopeful about is helping gamers who, in general, you think of them as kind of the disembodied, attend to themselves, and in particular attend to their body and what their body is saying and telling them.
Donald, if I could follow up. Oh, sorry. That's really exciting, and I want to talk with you more about using haptics.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. So haptics are like a sensory input that's like the buzzing in your phone, but a haptic actuator can give like a more nuanced, subtle inputs. And one of the projects that I've been working on that I'm pretty hopeful about is using haptics to do similar kinds of biofeedback and sensory augmentation and sensory extension, because we route a lot of data through this big channel of our eyes and our ears, but we actually have this whole other organ called our skin that has a lot of sensory inputs that's underutilized. And there's a lot of really interesting work by a guy named David Eagleman and some others who have routed and have replaced lost senses by rerouting sensory input through the sense of touch, but also extended senses to different kinds and novel kinds of human senses. Sometimes internal, like interoception, and then routing that out through a more conscious perception for a biofeedback application, but other times adding in new sensory inputs. And that can sound a little creepy. Like you might be on the space station and you can feel like how much of your solar array is actually charging, or maybe you're running a factory and you can feel in your body like the output of the different assembly lines. But to me that it really does. It really does capture this idea that we are malleable, we are changeable, and these brains that we've been given and these bodies that we've been given. We're at a moment in history where we have some opportunity to reshape some of our experiences in novel ways, and it just seems like a tremendous opportunity for people who are trying to solve problems around disease or chronic illness, but also to come up with novel ways of creating new experiences. I find that genuinely hopeful.
Thank you. My guess is a few of you have great answers to that, but we're going to have to cut this conversation right now. So many fascinating words from you folks in terms of the kind of technology and what you're working with. It's inspiring to me. So thank you for being on this panel.